So in this video, we're going to talk about how to evaluate employees' performance. This is often a necessary thing to figure out who's doing well, who maybe should get promoted or have extra benefits, and who maybe needs some more help and training. So performance appraisals in general is any way that you measure a worker's performance, and it's best to have some kind of standards that you're going to judge it by. That way it's not totally subjective. We'll talk more about that. And for workers, this is a good thing. It might seem stressful to have your performance evaluated, but if you're evaluated well, it means you can get pay raises, bonuses, maybe extra vacation time, or at least have your good work properly reinforced and appreciated. It also means that you can get feedback on your job performance, which means you can increase, how well you're doing your job. A lot of times workers are stressed because they don't know if they're doing a really good job, a mediocre job, or maybe they are making mistakes and not knowing it. So it can alleviate stress actually to be able to get good feedback on how well you're doing. And for supervisors, of course, it's absolutely necessary because supervisors have to make decisions all the time about what to do with their employees. Do employees need to get reprimanded? Do they need to get promoted, maybe even fired if there's something really serious going on? And then also it can give them feedback on their own success as a leader or manager. How well they're doing is often reflected in how well their workers are doing. For organizations, this is probably the top reason why performance evaluations are done. Organizations need to know how productive and efficient they are, and are there any ways to increase productivity or efficiency? And there's lots of ways in which performance evaluations can give that kind of data to them. It also allows them to figure out what to do with their employees. For example, are their selection practices working well? Are they hiring the right people? Could they maybe improve on their training? Is there ways in which employees are sort of lacking in the training that they're receiving? It can also look at, especially for IO psychologists, if you're doing any kind of interventions or training models, reinforcement models, are they working? And then, of course, it can help you to assess whether your supervisors are being successful with their workers. So are you implementing good leadership strategies? Are the group dynamics working well? A lot of things we'll be talking about in future lectures. For all of this, you need some kind of performance criteria or some way of determining how well people are doing their job. And oftentimes this is done with actual measurement tools like surveys and behavioral measures that have predetermined scoring systems or ways to figure out objectively beforehand whether or not someone's going to be doing a good job or bad job depending on their scores. So some common ones and some ones that we'll talk about is that you can have reviews from your supervisors. You can actually put out surveys and interviews as HR or IO psychologists. You can do different behavioral measures. We'll talk about a few different techniques. And then also you can have customer reviews which have their pros and cons. We'll get into that. Or, and this is a more controversial one, you can have electronic surveillance that's going on all the time. Usually this includes things like monitoring internet access and what emails are going through the servers, but it can even be a bit more invasive than that nowadays. Now, as far as sources of information go, the most common is stuff that you get from supervisors and managers. How well are their workers doing? And for the most part, this is actually pretty reliable and valid. For one thing, supervisors are, on the floor, they're working with the workers one-on-one, and they usually have a good understanding of what it takes to do a good job. So they know what kind of knowledge, skills, and abilities or KSAs are important for that role, and if their workers are maybe lacking in that. They also know that their own job depends on how well their workers are doing. So usually they're motivated to be honest and objective when evaluating their workers' performance, because they want to get the best out of their workers just as much as the company does. Self-appraisals, or when the workers appraise themselves, that tends to be the least predictive of actual job performance. One obvious reason, of course, is that people can overemphasize how well they're doing. So usually when you have someone evaluate themselves, they're not going to come up with a list of all their failings and weaknesses. Or if they do, it'll be things like, oh, I'm too organized, or I work too hard. So people tend to either be dishonest or just overly positive in their own self-assessments. Also, they often focus more on how much effort they're putting in rather than real-world results. And sometimes people can put in a lot of effort but not get a lot out of it, and that's good to know. Peer appraisals, or having workers evaluate each other, tend to be a little bit more reliable and accurate, but they still have some faults. For one thing, you want to make sure that your peers are not being too competitive or cooperative for this to work. They need to be neutral. So it's a problem if peers are maybe competing over scarce resources like a new position that's opened up or higher salaries, because that might make them review their peers more negatively in order to have sort of a step up. An even more common problem is that coworkers are often friends outside of work, so they're not going to want to throw their coworkers under the bus or blame them for things. And often what will happen is they'll cover for their coworkers that aren't doing so well. So again, self-appraisals and peer appraisals don't tend to be as reliable as supervisor appraisals. Now, subordinate appraisals, that's when workers evaluate their managers or leaders. Those actually tend to be pretty good. For the most part, what you can often get is just more information about what your leaders and managers are doing. Often your subordinates have sort of the best, most close-up view of how managers are leading. And so if you really want sort of all the information you can get, ask the people who are being led or supervised. Also, they tend to be more accurate if you get a lot of appraisals and collect them anonymously, so people aren't afraid of maybe getting retribution from their supervisors if they give them a negative rating. And the reason why you want to get a lot of people and maybe just average them together instead of looking at any one appraisal is with any manager or supervisor, you're going to get people who really probably dislike them. You'll also get some people who really like them. And so by averaging them together, you get rid of these biases, and you can sort of see on average how well are people working with them. And that tends to be pretty reliable, and it kind of reduces any kind of selection effects, like people who are the most upset or the most loving of their supervisors sort of get averaged out. Customer appraisals, like I said, that's kind of a controversial one. You definitely, if you're dealing with customers in your business, want to know how they feel about how things are working with your business and the people they're dealing with. The biggest problem is that if you have customers that are having single or just a few interactions with your business, they can give pretty unreliable feedback. The biggest problem is they tend to overreport any extreme example. So, a common one that I'm sure everybody uses are things like Amazon reviews. So if you buy something from Amazon and the product works just as you expect, you probably aren't going to think to go back on the website and provide a review. But if the product is faulty or doesn't live up to expectations, then you're much more likely to actually bother going online and leaving a negative review. So often people on Amazon sort of struggle with the fact that only people who are having a negative experience tend to leave reviews. It's often also the case that customers don't have a good idea of what constitutes good performance. So if you're a customer representative at a call line, you might get a customer who gets really frustrated with you not being able to serve them, but it could be that their demands aren't something you can serve or even something the company can do for them. It might be that what's restricting you is more the company infrastructure, how things are done at your company, much more so than your personal service. So in a lot of ways, customer appraisals tend to be unreliable. The one exception is if you have long-term customers who are pretty understanding of the way your business is run. So for example, if you are someone who works in a certain industry that relies on customers and long-term customer satisfaction. So for example, let's say you rent out equipment to construction companies. It's likely that you're going to be working with your customers on a regular basis, making orders, trying to satisfy them with their equipment, and that they're going to get to know you in your job. And so after a while, maybe after a few months, they'd be able to provide some pretty constructive feedback, especially if they're knowledgeable about the field. But that's a pretty rare instance in which customer appraisals actually yield reliable information. Now, a lot of companies are turning to electronic surveillance of their workers, meaning sort of unobtrusive ways to figure out what workers are doing, usually online. Now, a lot of companies, of course, monitor what phone calls or voicemails are going through their companies. And I think most people who work at a company realize that. In fact, if you call most customer service lines, they have a little message at the beginning saying this call may be monitored for customer service or services. But a lot of other companies are also monitoring any web activity. So for example, for anyone who's at a college, most often anything that you do on the internet that's going through school servers can be actively monitored. And this is of course done to especially check for illegal behavior. So more and more companies are turning to monitoring email even actively, often scanning emails for certain keywords. Now they have programs that are even scanning emails holistically to figure out if things like illegal activity or private information is being shared. And many more companies will store emails on private servers just in case they happen to be subpoenaed by courts, in case there's a court trial, or in case there's, like a discrimination or sexual harassment claim. They can go and check people's email to see if there's any evidence for that. In fact, one of my friends who works for a data processing company actually makes programs that actively look for any language that could be interpreted as sexual harassment. So they can quickly scan all the emails of an entire company, literally millions of emails, for any evidence of sexual harassment. So you got to be really careful what you put forward in emails these days. 30% of companies surveyed said they've actually fired workers based on their emails, and 40% said they had to turn over their emails to courts for court trials. So it's actually fairly common that email ends up being evidence used against workers. Now, 10%, this is a more new thing, are now monitoring social media posts. And that's pretty controversial because a lot of employees say, well, my social media is private. That's for my friends and family, not for the company. But there aren't any laws barring companies from doing this at this point. So this might become more common. Now, only 2 states, Delaware and Connecticut, actually have laws requiring companies to report exactly how they're monitoring employees. So unless you live in those 2 states, you really don't have much of a clue of how your company could be monitoring you. And that, of course, includes maybe the school that you're at, too. So this is something we're probably going to hear more about in the news, especially when it comes to maybe breaches of privacy, things like that. Now, there are some pros to electronic surveillance, of course. For one, it's cheap. It's easy to do, and it's objective. So for people who are just monitoring for illegal activity, for instance, it could be a great way to sort of tip people off if, for example, company secrets are being shared, or there could be a case for sexual harassment. So these tend to be pretty effective tools for doing certain things. It also helps to prevent inappropriate and illegal behavior because if people know that they're being monitored, they're going to be much less likely to actually initiate such behavior. It also, of course, helps companies protect themselves from lawsuits so that if a company is sued, they can perhaps provide evidence that nothing illegal is going on. It also helps to detect any kind of time waste or non-work related activities, although this actually tends to be the least common approach to electronic surveillance because it's kind of the hardest to prove. Unless you're finding out that your workers are spending hours on online shopping networks instead of doing their job, for the most part, this is sort of just a tertiary benefit of electronic surveillance at this point at least. Now, the biggest con, of course, is that a lot of workers assume that some of their interactions, at least, even online, are private, like emails, especially things like social media accounts. And so it's one of those things where the company often isn't very forward about how they're monitoring employees, and so it can sort of be a breach of assumed privacy. Also, there are some studies that show that when workers know that they're being monitored, they tend to be less risk-taking, less creative and innovative. So if a company wants their employees to sort of be on the cutting edge of what's possible and to take risks and be creative, they probably don't want to have a culture where people think that they're being monitored all the time. One good example that's been in the news lately of electronic surveillance really taken to the extreme is with FedEx. FedEx in the last few years have adorned their trucks and even their employees with all these monitoring tools. So if you see a FedEx driver with their little electronic clipboard, that is storing signatures and order reports, but it's also taking information on the truck driver's GPS locations, how much time they're doing, outside of the truck on each delivery. And in the trucks themselves, they record a lot of data on how much time it takes them to get from each destination, their speed to make sure they're not speeding or breaking the law. It even assesses how many left turns they make, because left turns are seen as less efficient than right turns. They're more prone to accidents and they take longer. And all this information has been able to save FedEx millions of dollars. This is one of the ways in which FedEx has really been able to survive and even thrive in an era when mail is becoming less common. So it's definitely cutting off time in terms of deliveries. It's cutting down accidents, especially driver accidents, which tend to be very costly. And if you think about it, with literally billions of deliveries being made each year, If you can save even 1 second off of the average delivery time, you're saving your company millions of dollars. But it's having a big drawback too. A lot of workers are being really dissatisfied with this micromanagement. For example, if a worker starts to back up their truck for too long, because backing up a truck can be seen as risky, it'll start to beep at them and they can even be reprimanded for making too many left turns. So having every single behavior micromanaged like that can be really stressful. And FedEx employees are starting to get the idea that they might want to unionize in order to fight this kind of micromanagement and excessive monitoring. Now, a lot of these measures sort of divide themselves on whether they're objective versus subjective. Objective, of course, means that you're getting basically numbers or numerical data that's based on real-world observations. So things that don't rely on someone's subjective views of worker performance. So for example, if you're in sales, then you can look at, well, how much are you selling? Or how much time you're spending with each customer. You can look at, if you're producing something, how much are you producing? Or what time it takes to produce each object. So these tend to be good assessments in getting just basic worker performance data. You can sort of take that as the opposite of subjective measures, in which it takes an actual person to figure out usually how much quality a worker is producing. So this is that more sort of hard to pin down kind of thing, like how do you determine if a worker is dedicated to their work, or is a good team player, or has good communication and social skills? Often there aren't objective measures of these, so these have to be sort of figured out on an individual basis, usually by supervisors. Usually these come with more open-ended responses. So if you have, for example, someone asking, so how dedicated is this employee? You're not going to just go, yes, they are dedicated, no, they are not dedicated. That'd be a closed-ended response. But you'd want to maybe talk about specific examples of how dedicated they are, maybe talk about different ways in which they show dedication. So usually this is sort of richer data, but there's also more room for bias. With objective measures, a big pro is that it really removes a lot of personal biases. So of course in this course we've been talking a lot about how things like discrimination and protected workers can often sort of have negative views or stereotypes thrown at them. With objective measures, that gets around a lot of that because it's not people making decisions, it's purely data-driven. It's also a lot easier to compare workers because every worker can be compared along the exact same types of objectives and numbers. So it's really a one-to-one comparison. Often also, this is pretty predictive of actual job success because it's directly tied with how successful the organization is. So it's usually tied with how many units sold or produced, how much time it takes to complete a job. So in this way, it's a real-world representation of how well someone's doing at their job. Of course, it comes with its disadvantages too. For example, there's a lot of KSAs or knowledge, skills, and abilities that are difficult to measure objectively. So for example, how can you put a number on how good someone is as a leader, or how well they're doing with customers, or their level of team spirit? In this case, these are sort of subjective views, but those are very important to determine how well someone's going to be working with their company or how well they're going to be turning out in terms of quality of work. So objective measures tend to measure work quantity very well, but not necessarily work quality, which is of course a really important thing to know. It also, if you especially using closed-ended questions like in a survey measure, you might be excluding a lot of important information if you're just neglecting to ask about it. So if you're only asking about, let's say, 10 KSAs or knowledge, skills, and abilities that you think are important, you might be neglecting a lot more that are actually important that you haven't even thought to measure. Now, subjective measures can often make up for these pitfalls. For example, if you can put things into words instead of data, then you can be a lot more versatile and flexible in how you describe workers. So that's good because if you have a good supervisor or someone who's recording data well, they're not going to be in any danger of missing information simply because the right question or the right survey tool hasn't been included on the form. They can describe it in however they wish and sort of pick on the behaviors, the KSAs that they think are the most important. Also, you don't have to spend all this time developing expensive and time-consuming measurement tools or spending a lot of money on ones that have already been developed. You can simply tell people, just observe workers or talk with them, interview them, and then come away with a report. And you can put this in your own words. Of course, the biggest disadvantage is this can be really affected by personal biases, and they also tend to only capture extreme or the most memorable examples or behavior. So just like we talked about with customer reviews, you can have the problem of only negative reviews sort of standing out enough to be reported. The same thing can happen with subjective measures. If you're a supervisor, you probably aren't going to notice when your workers are doing a sort of baseline average job, even if that job is pretty good. You'll probably notice when workers do exceptionally well, but you'll also notice when workers fall short. And that's probably what's going to end up in your reports more than the average day-to-day performance. It also doesn't necessarily cover all important KSAs, especially if the supervisor, isn't that great at assessing all the important ones. So it really depends on who's doing the reporting for how well the report's going to be. It can also be exceptionally difficult to compare workers, especially if they're being reviewed by different supervisors. So if you have one supervisor who tends to review people mostly positively, and the other one tends to review people mostly negatively, just due to personal biases, then you're going to have really unfair comparisons, because what workers you compare, their evaluations are really going to depend on who did their evaluations. A good example of a very subjective measurement model, as opposed to the FedEx model, are Yelp reviews. This is something probably most of you guys have used at some point. So a big pro of Yelp, which is a service where people can go on and provide any review they want of any public business, usually like restaurants, is that the customers can really easily evaluate any kind of service experience that they have. They can do this anywhere they please, and they can do it as much as they want. So you can get a lot of rich data from this. People can also describe it in any which way they please too, so you don't have to worry about missing important information. So customer ratings tend to be accurate in these networks as long as you have a lot of ratings, and then you can sort of average them or aggregate them across. So for example, if you have a restaurant that has over 100 ratings and it has pretty positive reviews, you can say, okay, that's probably a pretty good restaurant, even if there are a few reviewers who had negative experiences. But compare that to a restaurant who maybe only has 3 reviews, maybe 1 positive and 2 negative, you might assume that that's not a great restaurant, but also it could be biased in that only the negative reviews are being left on average. And that's the biggest con, is that usually you just get dissatisfied customers who are leaving the most reviews. Restaurants can try to encourage positive reviews by maybe holding signs up or hanging them up in their store or restaurant saying, please leave us a review, or even offering some kind of benefit if you leave a Yelp review, like a coupon. But in any case, usually what you get are people who have the extreme examples, both positive and negative, who are the most likely to leave reviews, which again doesn't give you a good view of the average day-to-day performance at that place. So one thing you need for all of these methods is some kind of criterion relevance or way to figure out, is whatever criteria you're using, whether it's objective or subjective, is it actually predicting job success? You can think of this as the validity or the accuracy of what you're using as an evaluation tool. And often different tools have what's called criterion contamination, or the degree to which something, a certain measure, is biased by factors that are unrelated to job success. For example, when we talked about job interviews, that's a sort of assessment tool. Often those are biased by how attractive an applicant is. So unattractive applicants tend to be viewed more negatively than they would based purely on any job-related KSAs. And people's level of perceived confidence, or how relaxed they seem. And a lot of times things like confidence and attractiveness have nothing to do with how well someone's going to do in their job. So both of those would be seen as criterion contaminating factors, or areas of criterion contamination. They're ways in which KSAs that are unrelated to job success are biasing how well someone seems to be doing in an evaluation. There's also something called criterion deficiency, which isn't so much a bias as just some way in which some important KSA is not being measured. So for example, if you're looking at how good leaders are, and you're just looking at how productive their workers are, you might be missing important factors like how well leaders communicate with their workers, or how well they get along with their workers, how satisfied their workers are. So some assessment tools can be too focused on productivity and not focused enough on maybe more soft interpersonal skills like communication and sociability. So that'd be seen as a deficit because you're lacking assessment of important aspects of a job. So when it comes to like objective versus subjective measures, objective measures typically have pretty high criterion relevance. So since you're measuring real-world results, they tend to be pretty predictive of actual job performance. So if you're looking at someone's sales records, that's obviously a good indicator of how good they are at sales because it's the hard data. How much have they been selling this month? They also tend to have low criterion contamination. Again, because they tend to be unbiased. They're more objective or just reduced to the data. So in this case, the reviewer that's reviewing you probably won't have too much of an influence on your review because all they can do is report objective data points. They can't sort of put in their own personal views. But there is a potential for criterion deficiency. So if a measure isn't made well and it's lacking questions or ways to analyze important KSAs, then in that case, you're going to have the problem of if you don't ask the right question, you're not going to get the right data. So in that case, you want to make sure that your measures are very well validated. And usually these are measures that are sort of developed by IO psychologists or experienced HR professionals and have been used in many cases. And so their validity can sort of be tested over time. How well does this really capture all of the KSAs that are important to this job? Now let's compare that to subjective measures, which tend to vary greatly in how relevant they are to actual job performance. On the one hand, if you have really well-trained supervisors or evaluators that are good at being objective and good at figuring out what kind of KSAs are actually important for a job, you can have really high criteria relevance or really high predictiveness of job performance. But of course, your evaluations are only as good in this case as those people who are doing the evaluating. So if you have a reviewer who's not so up on how a job should be done or how to measure quality of a job, or who's just personally biased in their job reviews, then in that case, you're going to have pretty poor criterion relevance. You also tend to have high criterion contamination. As we've talked about, these can easily be biased by subjective views, by different biases and how much people recognize negative versus positive behaviors, stereotyping, just all the things that kind of come in when you're asking for subjective measure of performance. There's also likewise a potential for criterion deficiency, but this again relies more on how good your evaluator is. So if your evaluator really recognizes all the important KSAs that are needed in terms of how well to perform a job, they should do a great job of making sure that they're capturing all of those important criterion. But if maybe they're not as knowledgeable, they might leave important stuff out. So it really depends on the evaluator in this case. So the best results people have found is from mixing these methods, from perhaps having some objective measures of KSAs, but also allowing for more of a free-form evaluation from supervisors, peers, and customers. In other words, get information from as many sources as possible, and you realize on the one hand, objective measures are going to be freer from bias, but they might be deficient in important KSAs that aren't coded in initially in these measures. Where on the other hand, while free-form subjective evaluations might be better at capturing the more the quality aspects of people's work, they might also have some personal biases thrown in too. So if you can recognize both of those weaknesses from each method, then you can kind of figure out, what is each method really good at. For example, you can use objective measures to look at data-driven evaluations, so how much people are selling or how much people are producing, and then supplementing that with measures of more the quality of their performance, such as how well they're interacting with customers, how well they're working with teams by using more subjective measures. So a good example of this is with Uber drivers. Now there's been, of course, a lot of complaints with Uber drivers on many things, but one of the things they tend to do well is how well they're evaluating their drivers, especially in terms of their customer service and their efficiency. So of course, their app collects a lot of data on their drivers, such as how long it takes them to do a particular trip, how quickly they can pick up and drop off customers, how many hours and how much money they're making. So they kind of have a good estimate of how well drivers are doing in terms of purely objective, data-driven efficiency measures. They can also get to know more subjective types of ratings from customer reviews. One thing that's kind of nice about customer reviews in this case is oftentimes when customers take an Uber, they're prompted to give a review. So they tend to collect a lot of reviews, and so they're more reliable. You don't get just the extreme reviews being submitted. Also, there are some reviewers or customers who tend to be more problematic or just give negative reviews. But the fact that drivers can review their customers, and then if the customer gets a lot of different Uber trips, they get evaluated by a lot of different drivers. These sort of problem customers can be evaluated or sort of picked out. And so their evaluations maybe won't carry as much weight. So if a customer is giving nothing but negative evaluations to Uber drivers who are normally receiving good reviews, people who are overseeing them can kind of figure out, okay, that's more the customer than maybe the driver that's the problem. And all this data can even allow them to do things like have their drivers be paid more during their busiest hours. So in this way, drivers can benefit too. It's not purely just penalizing bad drivers, but it's also rewarding good drivers who are maybe working at times when they're going to be at their busiest. Now, some different measurement methods, a lot of these sort of fit with different things we've talked about, like customer reviews, supervisor reviews, or objective reviews. One that's much more in the customer or supervisor review camp are called narratives. So this is when you just have someone describe how well someone's working or their quality of performance. Usually this is done with interviews or worker observations. Now, these are the most commonly used because they're cheap, they're easy to do, you don't have to have any measurement tool. You can just tell a supervisor or a customer, please write a review or a written description of how well someone's doing at their job. This also allows reviewers a lot of freedom, because it's a subjective measure, to use whatever kind of descriptions or talk about whatever KSAs they think are the most important. So again, this is sort of has all the benefits of a subjective measurement model. And it has all the disadvantages as well. So it has the problems of being able to compare workers. So if you have different reviewers giving very different accounts of the same worker, you kind of don't know which one to rely on. And of course, like we keep mentioning, it has a lot of extreme subjectivity in KSAs, or sometimes it's termed KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, or other attributes that are important. It also makes it hard to interpret whether or not a supervisor or a customer's review is fair, especially because a lot of times these reviews are very subjective. So if someone puts in, a worker does a fair job, what does that mean? Does that mean the worker's doing a good job or just an adequate job, or maybe even a barely passable job? You kind of don't know. So it's just subject to many biases, as we've been talking about throughout this lecture. Some other cognitive biases we haven't mentioned yet, but can definitely play a role, especially in subjective measures, are things like anchoring effects. So if someone comes in with some preconceived notion of how well a worker is doing or how well a worker should do, this can really bias how well they see their work performance. So a common type of error you see are called leniency errors or severity errors. Some supervisors who are especially lenient and want to give their workers all positive reviews will be biased in how positive they make the reviews. So they tend to ignore any problem areas and just focus on the positive. And of course, the reverse of that are severity errors when supervisors or customers come in and they just focus on all the negative stuff without reporting anything positive. So in this way, this anchoring effect of being sort of focused on either problems or good points of workers can really make supervisor customer reviews less reliable. You also have the issue of what's called halo effects or horns effects, in which if a supervisor customer thinks positively in general about a worker, then they're going to focus more on their positive characteristics than their more negative characteristics. So this is especially a problem if supervisors become friends with their workers, or if they just sort of think, well, if this person has some positive traits, like for example, maybe the worker is attractive or seemingly confident, then they'll just assume that they have a lot of other positive traits that they may or may not. And the opposite can happen with the horns effect. So if someone has some kind of negative aspect that really sticks out to the supervisor or customer, they can then have that bias them to see other negative effects. This has been seen a lot with discrimination against employees who are perhaps overweight or not attractive. People just assume that they have other sort of unattractive qualities about them, even if there's no evidence for that. So people can start to be really unfair in how they evaluate people if they have an initial negative expectation or perception of them. And the fact is that we humans, we're pretty quick to make judgments, and then once we make an initial judgment, we usually just spend the rest of the time sort of supporting that initial judgment with any evidence we collect afterward. So our first impression of people can have a huge effect on how we evaluate them afterward. So, if we tend to view people positively, then we're probably going to be biased by leniency and halo effects. Or if we tend to view people negatively, or if someone just rubs us the wrong way initially, we'll tend to be biased with a severity bias or a horns effect. And the thing is, from that point on, we'll usually just use that initial judgment to kind of comb through any other evidence and find supporting evidence more than inconsistent or unsupporting evidence. So if you think someone's a good employee, you're more likely when they do screw up to kind of give them a benefit of the doubt and go, well, they tried their hardest, or, oh, that's atypical of their performance. They usually do better. Whereas if you have a more negative view about them to start with, you're more likely to focus on those negative behaviors and then maybe ignore or not even remember positive behaviors. So the fact is, our memories and our perceptions aren't perfect. And so any of those biases can sort of leak into any narrative assessments. Now, a way to get around that is to use objective measures like we've been talking about. One such measure is called a graphic rating scale or a Likert scale. And this usually has some kind of predetermined rating system. So for example, you could say, well, how well do you rate the fairness of your supervisor? And you give them some kind of scale. In this case, it's a 1 to 5 scale from extremely unfair to extremely fair. Now this can help people to sort of be more objective in their ratings. There's still some subjectivity because it depends on what you perceive as fair or not. But at least everybody can sort of be compared along the same page. So the advantages here is that the measures are more clear, they're unambiguous. You can put them into numbers so you can run statistics on them or compare people directly. And also, you can sort of run hypothesis checks with them, see if certain training protocols lead to better reviews. One of the disadvantages, though, is that they lack flexibility. So these tend to be closed-ended responses. So someone could say that someone's extremely fair or extremely unfair, but you kind of don't know what they mean by that. Oftentimes, it can miss important KSATs or knowledge, skills, abilities, and traits. So especially if you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to get the right data. Also, there's no opportunity for clarification. So again, if someone gives a certain response, like that someone's being really unfair or not being a good worker, you can't go, well, what do you mean by that? Or how could they improve? So oftentimes, you also have to develop specific measures for specific jobs too. So this can be time consuming and expensive because if you have a company that maybe has 25 different job positions, well, then you need to come up with 25 totally different graphic rating scales. Also, the same response. So if you say, how often is someone treating their customers well, and they put in quite often, that can mean a lot of different things to different people. It could mean that to someone, it might mean that they almost always are generous and nice to customers. Others, it could mean, well, they're just nice to customers maybe 51% of the time or a slight majority of the time. So again, you kind of don't know unless you could ask people in more open-ended formats. Another rating scale that tends to be objective and maybe a better measure of specific behaviors is called the behaviorally anchored rating scale, or BARS. And what this usually does is it gives you anchors for each response. So it's kind of like a graphic scale in which you have different responses you can give, but then it also gives behavioral examples for people to figure out what might be the best response. So for example, if one of the questions is, when handling disagreements between subordinates, the manager performs very well, moderately well, or poorly, you can put anchors or behavioral anchors on it by saying, what do you mean by very well, moderately, and poorly? So very well could be that the person is very fair, they hear all sides of the argument before making any decisions. Whereas the poor could be they make decisions flat out, unilaterally, without discussing with anyone. And moderately can mean something in the middle. So this just gives someone a clear understanding that if they say someone's doing very well, moderately, or poorly, or whatever the scale is, you kind of know a little bit better about what they mean by that. Another a good measurement is a behavioral checklist, and this is purely just checking to see if workers are doing certain performances. This is usually really advantageous in work that is more performance driven, such as a stocks clerk or a sales clerk, where you can really just count off, are they talking to customers about warranty policies, yes or no? Are they stocking all the items in order or taking inventory properly, yes, no? So usually this is literally just a checklist. So for example, if you can observe a cashier serving customers, you can just check off, is that cashier patient and polite? Are they talkative and friendly? Are they counting the change back to customers? Are they asking the customers if they need stamps, if they're at a grocery store? So in that way, it can be very clear cut that if there are certain behaviors that a worker should be doing, that they're doing it. And the last version of this, called the behavioral observation scale, again, another objective sort of measure, this indicates whether a worker is performing certain behaviors more or less often. So this would be, for example, in the last month, how often have you seen the sales representative do the following? And then you'd actually just say how often, maybe 1 to 20 times or however many times they did it. So how often did they show interest in customers, interest customers in more expensive products? How often did they try to sell customers warranties or insurance, maybe if you're working at a store that offers those kind of services? So in this way, you can sort of count off, are they doing it most of the time, maybe just 70% of the time, 10% of the time? And that can really give you a good measure of maybe ways that you could better train employees or monitor their behavior going forward. So the advantages of all these more objective types of measures, especially behavioral measures like bars, checklists, and observation scales, is obviously they're objective. They tend to be good at sort of figuring out what kind of specific behaviors are being done or perhaps not done. And it really is clear what's being evaluated, much more so than perhaps with subjective evaluations or even just graphic rating scales that don't have those behavioral anchors. Often these are more predictive of job performance too, even than subjective or other types of objective scales, because it's very clear what's being evaluated, and everything that's being evaluated is really specific to the job being done. Some of the disadvantages, though, they're still closed-ended questions. So obviously they have that disadvantage of lacking flexibility. So if you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to get the right data. And also it can be difficult to use the same measurements for different jobs or have the same measure generalized to different jobs. So often it requires a lot of time and energy to create different types of measures for different specific jobs. Now with all of these appraisals and evaluation techniques, they're really kind of worthless unless they provide helpful feedback for workers. So the last thing we'll discuss here is how to provide helpful feedback after you've done evaluations. So usually, feedback that's given can be, especially if it's too vague or worded too negatively, pretty unhelpful. And so you see a lot of this kind of feedback being given by people who aren't properly trained in how to give good feedback. So for example, if someone says, you know what your problem is? You're just unmotivated. What's the problem with that? Well, for one thing, it's really vague. So what do you mean by unmotivated? It's also not constructive. It doesn't tell people how they can get better. So if you highlight just the negative and you don't tell people how they can improve, that's not very helpful. Same kind of problems with things like you need to work harder, or when serving customers, you can be so rude at them. So in these cases, again, they're very negative, they're not constructive. And in cases where you say someone's so rude, that can also be sort of a superlative, saying especially that someone's always rude or never helpful. These statements tend to be just untrue, but also they're just overly negative and not helpful. So with all these, you want to avoid being too vague, and especially it's great if you can provide specific examples of when they're not doing or not working at their best, and then constructively advise them on how they can do better. So for example, good feedback focuses on specific behaviors, not character, and gives specific information and recommendations rather than just sort of general ideas like work harder, be more motivated, be nicer. But you can say things like, I'd like for you to spend an extra few minutes doing this activity every day, or I want you to work on this specific skill, and I want to see improvement in that in this measurable way. So you want to be really specific about what your expectations and recommendations are. You also want to be proactive. You don't want to just sit there and blame people for what they've done in the past, but you want to say, okay, this is some way in which we can improve upon your work, in which you can become a better manager or a salesperson or whatever kind of job they're doing. And it's great if you can be coactive and collaborative. In other words, suggest how other workers can help contribute to changes and work together. You can also be collaborative with them and say, I'm going to put in this extra effort to make you better at your job. So we're going to work together on this. So just as an example of some better feedback that's more positive and allows for specific constructive ideas, one example could be, let's say someone's not doing a great job, maybe filing reports that are error-free. You could say, start with a positive, like you've been great at filing reports. You filed a lot of reports with us. You tend to be very fast and efficient at that. before you get to the negative and be specific. And you could say, but you seem to have some difficulty checking for typos in your reports. So there's a specific kind of problem. And then you suggest a solution. You could say, I suggest you spend an extra 5 minutes proofreading each report before filing it. So make it really specific what the expectation is. And then you can say something reassuring like, it's fine if you file fewer reports each day as long as they contain fewer errors. So you can set up your expectations to be really clear. That's a lot better feedback than just saying, all of your reports seem to have these typos, and can you do a better job, proofreading your reports? This way, people know exactly what's expected of them, and they know what to do going forward. Just one more example. If someone's not doing such a great job with customer relations, you can again start with a positive. So you've been on the sales floor all week and your sales numbers look good. So focus on a positive thing first and then get into the problem. However, we've gotten a few comments from customers that you seem stressed or hurried. And this might seem a little like a soft blow. You could be getting like really bad customer reviews, but you want to put that in a way so that you're not putting the worker on the defensive. So just saying that, you seemed a little stressed, tired, hurried, that shows that you have some sympathy toward your worker. And then lastly, the constructive feedback. You can go, please take some minor short breaks throughout the day, maybe some 5-minute breaks every couple hours or so that you can be as polite and relaxed with customers as you can be. And in that way, people kind of get the hint that, maybe they're being a little rude to customers, but it gives them a way to maybe get around that and de-stress. So in that way, the whole package is, you want good evaluations, not just so that you can see how well workers are doing, but also so you can make workers better. And that's really goes into how to provide good feedback.